thank you for the invitation. Farouk, thank you for bringing me back to Malaysia for the third time. Assalamu alaikum to everyone. This is my third visit to Malaysia and hopefully not my last visit. I have to admit that when I was coming into the airport, I was a little bit nervous. And I'm still a little bit nervous when I'm going to exit Malaysia on Monday, because when Mustafa Akyol was exiting, that's when they stopped him and arrested him. But I'm happy to be here to make a contribution, hopefully, to the struggle for democracy, Islamic reform, development in Malaysia. The topic for tonight, as you mentioned, is officially titled. You missed one word in the introduction. The official title of tonight's event is called "What Really Went Wrong with Muslim Societies: Postcolonialism and the Rise of Modern Apologetics." Mm-hmm. And the reason why that title has been suggested is, one, it comes out of this book by Khaled Abou El Fadl, but the term "what went wrong" is the title of a very famous book in the West that was published after 9/11 by the very prominent and controversial scholar of Islam, Bernard Lewis, who sought to explain why 9/11 happened and why Muslim societies seem not to have produced democracies and advanced societies, but they've produced 9/11 and authoritarian regimes. And so he wrote this very famous book that became a bestseller. And his argument basically was that there's something fundamentally problematic with Islam's political ideas, with its values. It has been unable to adapt to modernity. It's been unable to sort of appreciate the value of women. And the problems in Islamic society are fundamentally internal to its own society. Western foreign policy, colonialism, has very little to do with it. It's all about Muslims and their own internal problems. And this is one reason why the book was so popular, is because it reconfirmed existing stereotypes and prejudices that many Americans and Westerners had about the topic. And so Khaled Abou El Fadl, in his new book, he has a chapter and he says, he adds the word "really" because he wants to reject the narrative of Bernard Lewis. He wants to sort of provide an argument as to what really went wrong with Muslim societies. And this is chapter 8 from this massive book. I think it must be over 200,000 words long, and it's his most important book. And at the risk of sort of bragging a bit, I've blurbed the back jacket of the book because he sent me the manuscript, and I thought it was worth in endorsing the book. And so I want to talk about the argument in this chapter. But before doing so, I just want to pause for a moment and comment on the state of Muslim societies today at this point in our history. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that we are passing through the dark ages of Islam. I have no memory of things being this bad and this bleak and this dark. Yesterday, the heads of state of most of the Muslim majority countries gathered in Istanbul to issue a statement in defense of the Palestinians on the question of Jerusalem. And I sort of mockingly criticized them on my Twitter feed when I said that 50 years after Jerusalem was occupied in violation of international law, the corrupt heads of state of the Muslim countries gathered together and they issued a statement. I'm sure Israel is trembling in their shoes because of that statement. But the point that I really want to highlight, there's one event that actually happened earlier this year that embodies and reminded me of just how bleak and how dark this phase of Islamic history is. So these same heads of state that were in Istanbul yesterday, almost the same people gathered earlier this year in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, on May the 21st, 2017. 50 plus Muslim countries came to this event called the Arab American Islamic Summit. and it was a very lavish event that the Saudis hosted. They invited all these countries, and it was a lavish affair, and everyone gathered, all of these Muslim countries gathered, to listen to one person who traveled from the other side of the world and who was the guest of honor. They rolled out the red carpet, they danced with him, they projected his picture on the walls of the city, and the person that I'm referring to, who's the guest of honor, was none other than Donald Trump. And what's so interesting and revealing, and so shocking, but at the same time quite devastating in terms of the symbolic value of this particular event. It reminds us of how dark this moment in Islamic history is, because let's not forget that Donald Trump is the most anti-Muslim, Islamophobic president in the history of the United States. He campaigned openly and explicitly on anti-Muslim bigotry. He openly said, I want to ban Muslims from coming into this country. He played on the fear of Islam and of Muslims, and he mobilized Americans around this narrative. The first thing that he does when he gets elected is he passes this Muslim ban. It's condemned by the U.S. court system. He comes up with another interpretation of it. It's again condemned by the U.S. court system. He comes up with a third interpretation of it, and now it's still in the U.S. courts. The courts that looked at what Donald Trump was trying to do explicitly said that Donald Trump's Muslim ban cannot be accepted because it violates the equality provisions in the U.S. Constitution. In other words, it's explicitly targeting Muslims. And so it is against U.S. law. Now, did any of these things that Donald Trump say against Muslims affect the participation of the heads of state of most of the Muslim countries who gathered in Riyadh? Did one of them say, did one of them have the courage or the decency to say, I'm not coming to the Riyadh summit because the person that you're honoring is an openly anti-Muslim bigot? None of them had the courage or the decency to say so. They all went and they listened and they took photographs and they loved him. And stop and think about that. When in the history of Islam has something as disgusting as this ever happened? Where you would invite someone who's openly antagonistic to your own values and your own people, and you honor and celebrate him. This is an indication that we are in the dark period of Islamic history. And the sad thing about it is it doesn't look like things are going to change anytime soon. I don't see any reason to be optimistic in the short term. Maybe in the long term, but this is where we are. And you mentioned in your introduction the plight of the Palestinians. In neighboring Syria, over the last 6 years, 500,000 Syrians have been killed, created the worst refugee crisis since World War II, some people are saying. Iraq is destabilized. Yemen is a major humanitarian disaster. And then not too far from here, we have the ethnic cleansing and the persecution, and some say the genocide against the Rohingya Muslims. Did one Muslim country, with all of their wealth and all of their power, do one thing significantly to alleviate the suffering of the Rohingya? No. I just read on the news the other day, in this month alone, close to 10,000 Rohingyas were killed, about 1,000 children. So this is where we are. This is a sad and depressing moment. And so the question is, during this period of Islamic history that is so bleak and so dark, where does one turn for some hope, for some optimism, for some inspiration? And from my perspective, where I tend to look for some hope and for optimism and for some inspiration is in the writings of significant Muslim intellectuals who have thought deeply and profoundly about how Muslim societies have degenerated to this point in time and what might be done to start a process of renewal, rejuvenation, and reformation. And one such person who I think really deserves to be singled out for his scholarship, for his insight, for his analysis, is Professor Khaled Abou El Fadl. So my first question to you is, how many people actually know who Khaled Abou El Fadl is? Does anyone know anything about his background? You raised your hand. What is it? What do you know about him? What?
His book.
But do you know what he does for a living?
Oh, no.
Does anyone know? Okay, so that's one of the things that I want to start with. Khaled Abou El Fadl is a professor of law with a specialization in Islamic law at UCLA in Los Angeles. He's been teaching there for over a decade now, I think over close to 15 years. He teaches courses on international human rights, Islamic jurisprudence, terrorism, Islam and human rights. He's also served on the board of Human Rights Watch, which is one of the most distinguished human rights organizations. He's actually one of the lone Muslims who have, reached that level of contribution. And he really is both a Islamic intellectual, a legal scholar, and an author of many important books. His most famous book that has sold the best is this book called The Search for Beauty in Islam, A Conference of the Books, which is this wonderful book where he really, as a believing Muslim, simply meditates on the state of the Muslim Ummah, the state of the Muslim world, and he does it in the context of this very vast library that he has at his home, that I'll say something about. This book that brings us here today, Reasoning with God, is, I believe, his 8th book that he's published. In many ways, it's its most important book. It's a book that is about his own personal upbringing and journey, but fundamentally it's about the condition and the decline of Islamic societies and what might be done to resurrect them. I encourage the listeners and the audience to look at his books and to read them. Some of them are very dense academic books. One is his PhD dissertation that he wrote. That's a very dense treatise on the question of violence and rebellion in Islamic law. But this is his 8th book, and it took him 10 years to write the book. I actually saw the early draft of it that was first written in 2005, and it's gone through many revisions, and in many ways this is his most important book. I told him when I read the book, this easily could have been 5 different books, because it's so dense, and there's so many different aspects of it. And what's important, and I think what makes Khaled so influential and insightful, is that he has deep knowledge and affection of 2 intellectual and civilizational traditions. One, Western civilization, its history, its politics, its philosophy, and also Islamic civilization. He's a scholar and an expert in both. He is trained, he got his education at the best schools in the United States, Ivy League schools, University of Pennsylvania, Princeton, and Yale, where he did his undergraduate. He also has formal training in Islamic jurisprudence in Egypt and in Kuwait. So he's a deeply versed scholar in the history of Islamic law, Islamic philosophy, Islamic political theory. And this allows him, because he has deep grounding in both civilizational traditions, to make comparisons, to comment on what's happening in the West, but also to comment on the history and the problems and the intellectual discourse within Muslim societies and within Muslim intellectual debates. And that's, I think, fundamentally what makes him so interesting to read and makes him such a compelling speaker. People call him an intellectual, a sheikh, an ustad, a human rights scholar. I think he's just someone who's worth reading and who's worth studying because he brings profound insight into what's happening in Muslim societies today. I think the best description that I have of Khaled, and I've written about this particular book because I reviewed it when it came out in the journal Critical Muslim, where I sort of provide my own analysis, and I say that the best description for describing what Khaled Abou El Fadl is as an individual is that he, I think, is best described as a Muslim ethicist. A Muslim ethicist. He's interested fundamentally in questions of ethics, of right and of wrong, and the philosophy of how one can think about the Islamic tradition in ways that advances an ethical and humanitarian discourse out of that tradition of Islam. Now, on a personal note, if you visit Khaled Abou El Fadl at his home in Los Angeles, and I've spent many times visiting him at his home, 2 things strike you when you go to his house. One, he has this vast library of books over 50,000 volumes in his home. And every time that I go to visit him, the living space where he greets people becomes smaller and smaller and smaller because the books take over. And in fact, on the upstairs floor of his house, there's so many books that the roof is starting to bend a little bit. And in fact, he has so many books that he's actually had to move to a new house because his home is now... And what's interesting also about the books is that he has a special secret vault where the most precious historic manuscripts that he's collected, some of them going back to the 10th century, are in his home. He has people scouring the bookstores of the Islamic world looking for special books. So he's a lover of books. He has over 50,000 volumes. The other thing that strikes you when you go to his house is that he has 20 dogs. The dogs bark, they jump at you. His wife has to come and restrain the dogs and put them in the backyard. Then you can go into the house, and there's like 5 or 6 dogs that are running around. And one of the things that he's written about is he tries to push back against this narrative in Islamic tradition that says dogs are inherently unclean or najis. He says this is something that does not stand up to Islamic scrutiny. There's no validity. And so he's written these deeply persuasive Islamic arguments and articles trying to rethink this idea. And he's saying that dogs actually, we say in the West that dogs are man's best friend, and he says there's actually, if you understand the nature or the fitra of a dog, it has a unique quality. And so he loves dogs, and many of these dogs actually are dogs that have been picked up on the side of the road because they've been injured, they don't have a home, and he's resuscitated them. And so these are the two things that strike you when you go to his house. And then you get into the conversation, and then before you know it, 5 hours have passed, and you're lost in the debate and the discussion, and you go away feeling very enriched and very sort of intellectually stimulated by your interaction with Khaled. Now, he begins this book, Reasoning with God, by pointing out that it was a very painful book for him to write. And it was painful because of the social and political conditions of the Muslim world. They've declined, and this is a deep source of anxiety for him. And it was a source of pain to sort of write this book. But he says at the heart of his personal agony that led him to write this book is another view, that he is torn by this reality of living as a Muslim in the West, that he finds Islam, according to his own words, a faith that is a source of boundless wisdom and tranquility and inspiration for himself. But at the same time, this same religion that he values and he appreciates is viewed by many non-Muslims around the world as a religion that is associated with violence, intolerance, injustice, and oppression, embodied in the ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And so this is deeply painful for him as a Muslim. And so he's trying to sort of make sense of these two sort of polarities that he sees in terms of how Islam is understood by him, but how many people in the West and in the non-Muslim world view Islam today. And so he writes that the book really is an attempt to make a contribution to a theology of human moral progress within the Islamic tradition. He's trying to reclaim Islam for the contemporary age, and he's trying to do so in a way that addresses both Muslim audiences and non-Muslim audiences. And he's trying to fundamentally, provide, as I said a moment ago, an ethical and humanitarian and humanistic interpretation of Islam. And one of the big concerns that motivates Khaled for a very long time, and it comes out in this book, and it is discussed extensively in this chapter, is that there has been in recent decades in Muslim societies this phenomenon that he calls the rise and mainstreaming of a culture of ugliness in modern Islam. He says in the context of Islam's 1400-year history, this is a recent development. It goes back maybe 40 or 50 years, he says. But this culture of ugliness has obtained a critical mass, sinking deep roots in Muslim societies in the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st century. And he says the spread of this culture has had corrosive effects on Muslim communities, and it continues, and I'm quoting him here, to be the single most important obstacle to articulating reasonable narratives of the legitimate possibility of Islam's contribution to human goodness. This rise of a culture of ugliness. And he connects this rise and this interpretation of this culture of ugliness, he traces it back to the heart of the Arab and Islamic world, and specifically links it to the internal policies and histories of one particular country that is at the heart of the Islamic world, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And he is talking, of course, here about the spread and the dissemination of a particular Wahhabi interpretation of Islam that has gone mainstream in Muslim societies, that presents itself as normative Islam, as the Islam of the Prophet Muhammad, as the Islam of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, and that unfortunately this extreme interpretation of Islam has now been adopted and internalized by many Muslims, thinking that this is the ideal Islam that we should be pursuing. And he says this is fundamentally at the core of a lot of the reasons as to why Islamic civilization has been declined. And unless you can push back against this interpretation of Islam, there is no hope of reforming, revitalizing, rejuvenating, and allowing Islam to develop and become a source of inspiration for Muslim societies that can then propel them forward. And so chapter 8 very much is really about this topic. If you get a chance to read it, it's very much about the history of Wahhabism, how it came about, and how it became mainstream in Muslim societies over the last 50 years, and the very toxic and corrosive effects that it has had on Muslim communities and how they think. And so, since this is a reading session advertised by the Islamic Renaissance Front, what I want to do is I have a series of quotations from the book that I want to read and discuss and elaborate. Because, you know, sometimes you read something that is so powerful and compelling that you just wish you could just read the entire thing in public and have everyone read along with you, because the prose and the argument is so fascinating and insightful. But since it's a very long chapter and we have limited time and I want to hear from other people, I'm going to limit myself to a few selected excerpts from the chapter that was in this book, chapter 8, and then we can discuss it, and I'll comment on the various selections from this chapter as we go along. So fundamentally what this chapter is trying to do is trying to explain and link the rise and spread of Wahhabi Islam to the question of colonialism and postcolonialism. He's trying to sort of make an argument that there is a connection between the legacy of colonialism, the emergence of the post-colonial phase in Muslim societies, and then the spread and the mainstreaming of this toxic interpretation of Islam that he calls puritanical Salafism. That there's a link between these two events. And the first quotation that I want to read from you is from the beginning of the chapter that was assigned for reading. And it speaks to sort of a very interesting phenomenon that when I read it, I said, that's exactly what's going on. He's articulated something that I've noticed and I've seen happening, and he's been able to, I think, put his finger on this problem. And it begins, I think, to create an argument where we can understand why there is such a weakness in terms of the intellectual ideas and arguments that Muslims have been using for such a long time, and how that sort of intellectual lethargy or lack of sophistication or weakness has actually created a situation where Wahhabism was then able to come and take over and sort of establish itself as a mainstream interpretation of Islam. So this first excerpt is right from the beginning of the chapter, where he talks about the legacy of colonialism and its relationship to the Muslim desire to engage in what Khaled calls sensational acts of power symbolism. And so he writes in the book, At least since the 18th century, the normative imperatives and intellectual subtleties of the Islamic moral tradition have not been treated with the analytical and critical rigor that Islamic tradition rightly deserves, but they have been rendered subservient to political expedience and symbolic displays of power. Elsewhere, I have described this phenomenon. It says, elsewhere I have described this contemporary doctrinal dynamic as the preponderance or the predominance of the theology of power in modern Islam. And it is this theology that is a direct contributor to the emergence of these radicalized Islamic groups that we've seen in the world today. And he says this particular dynamic has created and has perpetuated these acts of ugliness that take place in the name of Islam. Taliban, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, etc. Far from being an authentic expression of inherited Islamic paradigms or a natural outgrowth of Islam's classical tradition, these groups and their impulsive and reactive modes of thinking are a byproduct of colonialism and modernity, he says. These highly dissonant and defensive modes of thinking are dissociated from Islamic civilizational experience with all of its richness and diversity, and they invariably end up reducing Islam to one single dynamic, the dynamic of power. They tend to define Islam as an ideology of nationalistic defiance of the other, a rather vulgar form of obstructionism to the hegemony of the Western world. Therefore, instead of Islam being a moral vision given to humanity, it becomes constructed into a nationalistic cause that is often the antithesis of the West. In this sense, in the world constructed by Puritan modes of thinking and their groups, there really is no Islam. There is only opposition to the West. This type of Islam that the Puritan orientations offer is akin to a perpetual state of emergency, where expedience triumphs principle and illegitimate means are consistently justified by invoking higher ends. In essence, what prevails is an aggravated siege mentality that suspends the moral principles of the religion in pursuit of the vindications of political power and the symbolic displays of defiance to Western domination. In this siege mentality, there's no room for analytical or critical thought. There's no room for seriously engaging with the Islamic intellectual heritage. There's only room for bombastic dogma and for a stark functionalism that ultimately impoverishes the Islamic heritage. And so what he's saying here is that many of these groups, whether they're the extreme Taliban, Al-Qaeda, or ISIS groups, or even many of the more mainstream political Islamist groups, they define Islam as opposition to the West. That's their primary mode of identification. They're not interested in engaging with Islam's intellectual, ethical, and humanistic tradition. They're fundamentally interested in what he calls symbolic acts of power. A demonstration, burning a flag, storming, an embassy, shouting defiance against the West in some sort of symbolic. That's what it becomes to be a Muslim. And so he says the problem with that is that it completely corrupts and ignores the much deeper and richer history of Islamic ethical discourse discussion. That's completely forgotten, and Islam becomes about resisting whatever the West happens to be doing. He acknowledges that the reason for this is understandable, because Muslims are in a period of their history where they're under siege. Their lands were colonized. The postcolonial era has not promoted the promises of development and of democracy that was made to them. Palestine acts as a symbolic sort of reminder of the humiliation of the Muslim world. So there's a lot of good reasons for this. But when you define and when your identity as a Muslim becomes fundamentally about what the West is doing, and then you define yourself against that, that becomes basically a very narrow and rigid form of Islam that has very little to do with Islam's heritage, tradition, and it becomes very much reactive and interested in symbols related to power. So many of these Islamic groups are very much interested in doing what other revolutionary groups in the West have done over the last 200 years, capturing the state and then implementing their vision on society. It becomes basically a revolutionary movement that is defined in relationship to what the West has done. There's no ethical content. There's no sense that, look, are there any sort of rules of right and wrong that we should be pursuing that comes out of our intellectual heritage that should guide our actions? So when you actually read some of the more extreme arguments of some of these people, such as bin Laden, and when bin Laden is confronted with arguments that, look, in Islamic law, there are clear rules for how you should wage war. There's strict prohibitions against going after women and children and the innocent. How do you justify these acts of violence? And he justifies it in the way that Khaled has just framed it, that the West is so oppressive, is so violent, that whatever we do is justified because we're fighting against a deeper and more profound enemy. And this opens the door to a lot of acts of injustice, as we've seen today in many parts of the Muslim world. So this is sort of, one observation that Khaled makes at the beginning that I found was quite insightful. The next excerpt that I want to read from the book is from the earlier part of the chapter, and it deals with the decline of this humanistic and ethical tradition that existed in Islam and that has declined over time. And he tries to explain why has this great civilizational tradition, this great religious tradition, why has it declined, and why has these revolutionary groups, these violent groups, these extremist groups, why have they emerged? How can we explain this? And so he says that what makes the Puritan challenge today particularly compelling and singularly threatening to Islam's humanistic tradition is the deconstruction of the older institutions of religious authority in the age of modernity. Historically, these institutions played a primary role in undermining and marginalizing the supremacist and puritanical movements that emerged in Islam's past. In addition, given the primacy of the apologetic intellectual orientations within contemporary Islam, not only does it not bode well for the ability of Muslims to overcome these supremacist and puritanical movements, but even more, such apologetics are the main undercurrent feeding into these movements. Of course, the institutions of traditional or classical learning, the institutions that are explained before, that used to exist before and that produced Islamic fuqaha or Islamic religious leaders, they have a problem that needs to be dealt with because they were very patriarchal and they were very hierarchical. He acknowledges that those old Islamic institutions were not ideal for the modern era, but he says, still, notwithstanding their problems, the existence of these older Islamic institutions provided and contributed to an interpretive tradition and an institutionalized mechanism for negotiating Islamic law in relationship to contemporary political challenges and social challenges. And the withering away of these institutions that used to exist and would at least provide some Islamic guidelines for dealing with social political problems in the context of the colonial period and in the context of the post-colonial period, these Islamic institutions no longer exist. They were controlled by the modern states, and he said the absence of these older Islamic institutions, the absence of the independence and the autonomy of the once clerical and religious community provided a check and balance against these extremist movements coming up and then capturing a wide following. Whenever this would happen in Islamic history, there were these independent Islamic institutions that would prevent these from happening. And he says this is a problem, and this has contributed to the rise of these movements. Now, of course, this raises the question of to what extent are these older Islamic institutions of Islamic learning valuable today? And this is one of the issues with respect to Khaled Abou El Fadl that becomes a little bit controversial. He is a jurist. He believes that the old Islamic institutions, the old intellectual debates, the old juridical arguments that defined and constituted the development of Islamic law are of value. They need to be updated to the modern condition. But the mechanisms, the schools of thought, the paradigms were so rich and intellectually sophisticated that because they've been effectively co-opted by modern states, that this has contributed to the decline of Islamic civilization. And I remember talking to him one time, and he would say, Nader, you know, if I want to get really intellectually stimulated, if I really want to have my intellectual juices flowing, I will not read contemporary juridical debates among clerics today. I'll go back to the 10th, 11th, and 12th century, and I'll read the debates among Islamic clerics and Islamic legal scholars. He's saying those debates were so intellectually rich and sophisticated that it blows my mind, and I'm just saddened by the fact that that tradition of debate, contestation, ethical and moral argumentation has been basically lost by this contemporary generation. And so this is one of the arguments that he advances as to why we are in this particular dilemma. And then he talks about this apologetic tradition in the next part of the reading that I want to talk about and that you'll be somewhat familiar with. He talks about this as apologetic tradition, and he defines it in the following way. The apologetic orientation in modern Islam consisted of an effort by a large number of commentators to defend and salvage the Islamic system of belief and tradition from the onslaught of Orientalism, Westernization, and modernity by simultaneously emphasizing both the compatibility but also the supremacy of Islam in relationship to the attack, the onset of modernity, but also the attack on Islam by these Western scholars. The response to the onset of modernity, in other words, was this development of this apologetic argument. Apologists in the modern Islamic world responded to the intellectual challenge of modernity by adopting pietistic fictions about the Islamic tradition that eschewed or rejected any critical evaluation of Islamic doctrines. The main methodological tactic of the apologists was to celebrate Islam as a perfect, holistic totality. In the wake of the crumbling of the Ottoman Empire and the fall of the Caliphate in the early 20th century, the apologists believed that Islam confronted an overwhelmingly and devastating danger, and the response to that danger was to basically come up with this argument that Islam was perfect, Islam had all the answers, Islam discovered democracy, women's rights, human rights way before the West did, and there's no reason for us to rethink anything. And he says this was part of a reaction to the decline of Islamic civilization and to the attack and the crumbling of Islamic civilization. And so many of these Islamic theoreticians, particularly in modern Islamic political thought, starting from Banna, going on to Qutb, going on to Maududi, going on to Khomeini, and moving forward, if you read their writings, the theme that keeps coming up time and time again is that Islam has all the answers. Islam is perfect. Everything that we need is there in the Quran. You just have to read the text, and you have to have belief. If you have belief and you read the text, that's all you need to do. And he says this type of thinking, this development of an apologetic tradition tried to persuade Muslims of the completeness and perfection of their religion, and it fought to retain the loyalty of Muslims to their faith. In addition, apologists also responded to the European tendency in the late 19th and 20th century to emphasize the enlightened rationalism at the expense of Western religion. Apologists took it as an article of faith that if Europe was going to secularize, and if Europe was going to advance, and if Europe was going to go through this particular path, Islam was absolutely different. Islam did not need to think critically about the relationship between religion and state, didn't need to think about the question of citizenship, of equality, of secularism. Islam was perfect, and Islam did not need any reforming. All that Muslims needed to do was to have belief and was to practice the rituals, and if you did that, Islam had all the answers. And this led to the adoption of an intellectual laziness, an intellectual inability to reject the effects of modernity and to believe that modernity was just a problem that would affect Christianity, Judaism. It didn't affect us. And so what you see is that a lot of these Muslim students who come to the West over the years were very happy in accepting the aspects of modernity that had to do with technology, science, physics, chemistry, engineering, medicine. We could accept those aspects of modernity, we could study them, and we could make contributions to them. But the social sciences, the humanities, philosophy, those were things that Muslims had no interest in pursuing, and they were also told that they had no reason to pursue those things because Islam was perfect. And this development of this apologetic tradition that really tried to bracket or shield Muslims away from the effects of modernity contributed to what he calls this apologetic tradition in Muslim societies, and it contributed to the problem that we're in today. So he says in the book that there was this common learning technique that apologists started to advance in the Islamic world in the 20th century. According to apologists, Islam, as I just said a moment ago, liberated women, created democracy, endorsed pluralism, protected human rights, and guaranteed social security long before these institutions ever existed in the West. Nonetheless, these concepts were not asserted, Khaled writes, out of a critical understanding of what democracy was, what human rights was, what citizenship was, what women's rights really meant. They were just slogans that were advanced in order to affirm a self-worth and to give Muslims what he calls this measure of emotional empowerment, to make Muslims feel good, at a particular moment, Although apologetics, he says, initially arose in response to a particular historical challenge, the impact of this orientation far exceeded the context in which it arose. Once Islamist intellectuals utilized the paradigms of apologetics, it became very difficult to alter the terms of the discourse. Apologetics are easy to start and to generate, and they're superficially very satisfying. Often in this type of literature, an author in a single book will address all of the problems ranging from the liberation of women to democracy to economics to law and any other topic that was deemed necessary to prove the superiority of Islam and all other possible competitions. In many ways, the practice of apologetics proved to be like an addictive drug. It induced a pleasant state of oblivion and artificial self-confidence, but the problems remain unchanged. The practice gave easy, simplistic, and holistic responses to every challenge, but it also immunized its audience against critical thought. And that's exactly, I think, what I sort of realized when I started to, think about these issues as a young Muslim growing up in the West. I would go to mosques, I would go to Islamic conferences, I would listen to what speakers would be saying, and they would be so intellectually immature, so intellectually vacuous in the arguments that you would hear these speakers. I remember growing up in Canada, going to university, and one of the big debates and one of the big videotapes, this was before the internet, right? So people were showing videotapes, is there was this guy who was very famous among young Muslim activists. He was from South Africa, and everyone used to watch his video and his debates, and you might remember his name. He was called Ahmed Deedat. And Ahmed Deedat would engage in these arguments with Christian preachers over whether Islam was superior to Christianity or not. And he knew the Bible very well. He was a good public debater. And so he would have these debates, and Muslims would feel very good because he would be able to defeat in the debate some Christian preacher. And he would make Muslims feel good. Yes, we have the right answer. Look, we have this debate. And he won the debate, and the Christian preacher doesn't even know his own Bible, and isn't Islam such a great religion? But of course, the problem for modern Muslims was not the question of whether Islam was superior or better to Christianity, The problem for Muslims was the question of modernity, which really doesn't deal with the question of religion, deals with the question of human rights, of democracy, of citizenship, of philosophical skepticism. And so in that whole debate, there was nothing happening within Muslim circles that dealt with those topics. So you would go to the Muslim Students Association in the university that I had, and you would see the books that were on the table from the Muslims, and they were all these books that were published in Saudi Arabia or in Pakistan, and they were poorly edited, and they all dealt with these superficial topics that had nothing to do with the contemporary modern period. And so this type of intellectual sort of backwardness or weakness has become a dominant mode of the apologetic tradition. And then he goes on to write, Khaled, the main effects of apologetics, however, was to contribute to a sense of intellectual self-sufficiency that often descended into moral arrogance. Muslims felt very confident. Look, we have all the answers. Everything is there. We discovered all of these things before the West did. Of course, it was an argument that, it got to a point, I remember, that we would go to these public meetings and there'd be a public lecture, and my friends and I would be very worried if a Muslim student or an elder in the community would get behind the microphone and ask a question. Because often the question that they would ask in an audience of non-Muslims would be so inarticulate, it would be embarrassing for us as Muslims, and so we would always say, please don't get behind the microphone and answer a question, because then it's going to look very bad for us. Because they were reflecting a certain intellectual, weakness, rooted in this apologetic tradition that Khaled Abou El Fadl says was habit-forming. It produced a culture that rejected self-critical and introspective insight, and it embraced the projection of blame and fantasy-like level of confidence and arrogance. Effectively, apologists got into the habit of paying homage to the presumed superiority of the Islamic tradition, but marginalized the Islamic intellectual heritage in everyday life. While apologists revered Islam in the abstract, they failed to engage the Islamic tradition as a dynamic and living tradition. To a large extent, the apologists turned Islam into an untouchable, but also entirely ineffective prize, simply to be admired and to be showcased as a symbol, but not to be critically engaged or dealt with. So the argument here is that these people were claiming to be proud Muslims, but they knew nothing about Islam's rich intellectual and moral tradition. They could not adapt it to the modern period, and they were just engaged in these very superficial arguments that would not stand up to critical scrutiny if they were ever challenged in a public debate. And so this is where he begins to lay out an argument that this apologetic tradition is linked to the rise of Puritanism. Because it didn't develop any sophisticated, strong arguments rooted in Islam's own intellectual past, it created a very superficial level of discourse that allowed for Puritanism to come in and assert itself as a more authentic argument that is foundational, and it was allegedly coming out of Islam's pristine and authentic past. And so he writes, the narrative must start with the apologists. In other words, the narrative in trying to explain the rise of Puritanism or Wahhabism must start with the apologists, because they created a climate most conducive to the spread of this Wahhabi trend. The irony is that the apologists did not actually share with the Puritans their purpose or cause, and many of the arguments of the two orientations were clearly at odds with one another. Nevertheless, it is highly doubtful that without the apologetic orientation that the Puritans would have been able to impose themselves as a serious force in contemporary Islam. They, in other words, created the intellectual conditions that allowed for Wahhabism to come and assert itself. And so then the chapter begins and tries to make an argument for how Puritanism became mainstream, how it started to dominate the discourse of Islamic societies. And he goes on and sort of lists 4 reasons that I think are worth reading. I won't go into the details, you can read it yourself. But that's, I think, fundamentally the first section of the book. It tries to sort of link the very superficial rise of apologetics, to basically creating an open field where Puritanism or Wahhabism was able to come and assert itself as a much more allegedly authentic representation of Islam's heritage, because there was no counterforce. There was no ability to push back against that narrative that was solid, that could meet the needs of Muslim societies, and that could also lay claim to being authentically Islamic. And the Puritans come in claiming that this is Islam. This is what the Prophet Muhammad and his companions stood for. And if you're a Muslim, you have to follow this interpretation. What's so sad today about the spread of Puritan, Salafi, Wahhabi Islam is that if you're a young Muslim today in Toronto, Canada, where I'm from, London, England, Denver, where I currently live, or any other major Muslim city, and if you want to find out something about your own heritage and your own identity, the likelihood of you being exposed to a puritanical, Salafi, Wahhabi interpretation of Islam is very high. The likelihood of you being exposed to Khaled Abou El Fadl, or Fazlur Rahman, or Abdul Karim Saroush, or Muhammad Iqbal is very small. These people exist, but go to any mosque, go to any Muslim community center, you will not see these books. I had a friend who'd actually did a content analysis of the books in one particular mosque and bookstore in Birmingham, England. He surveyed the books. 80% of the books that were on sale came from this puritanical Wahhabi Salafi narrative. 80%. So exposure to alternative interpretations are not there. If you're a young Muslim and you want to find out something about your faith, you're going to be exposed to this particular interpretation of Islam. And the reasons for that are many. And it's partly because Saudi Arabia has spent a lot of money over the years. I've seen figures that since the 1950s, Saudi Arabia has spent about $100 billion on promoting, propagating, disseminating, giving scholarship, building mosques, bringing students over to Saudi Arabia to study and then going back to propagate this particular interpretation of Islam. Compare that with the Soviet Union during its entire existence from 1917 to, let's say, 1989. The generally accepted figure is $7 billion was spread in terms of the propagation of communism and Soviet ideology. $100 billion. If someone were to give me $100 billion, I could change the way many Muslims think. It's a question of, and I know from my own experience, just seeing this in Canada, people who've lived long enough and are old enough can see the gradual but steady spread of Wahhabi Islam affecting Muslim communities. I remember what it was like to grow up in Canada in the 1970s and how there was a community that my parents were part of. It was an immigrant community. People came from different parts of the world. It was Sunni and Shia. There was no question of sectarianism. And I know that for a fact because my family comes from Iran. They come from a Shia background. But we went to a mainstream Sunni mosque. All of my teachers were Sunni. The question of sectarianism and Sunni Shia was not on the agenda. But as you get into the 1980s and you get into the 1990s, you begin to see a new current, a new antagonism, a new way of thinking that can be traced back to Saudi Arabia. It has political dimensions in terms of the Saudi-Iran rivalry, but it also has a lot of money behind it. And so this is a big problem. Now, I just want to end very quickly here with just a few words on the sections of the chapter that deal with Wahhabism. And he talks about the spread of Wahhabism, where it came from. I think it's actually one of the best condensed analysis and interpretations of Wahhabism, where it emerged, how it spread, and how in many ways the spread of Wahhabism, and this is what the argument of the book is a complete rejection and a complete aberration from Islamic history. So when Wahhabism emerges in Saudi Arabia, it wasn't Saudi Arabia, there's the Arabian Peninsula. Local Muslims who are coming on the Hajj pilgrimage are really shocked about what they're seeing. The extremism, the attacks, the Puritanism, the people are just, they've never seen this interpretation of Islam before. And many Muslims at the time thought, well, there have been these movements historically in Islam, they emerge and then they're crushed. You had the Khawarij in the early days, you had these assassins in the 12th century, and people thought, okay, these Wahhabis have emerged from the desert, they will be crushed and they'll disappear. We don't need to really worry about them. But what happens is Wahhabism doesn't disappear. It doesn't disappear, one, because it becomes allied with the Ibn Saud family, which founds the state of Saudi Arabia, and it uses the Wahhabi clerics and interpretation as the foundation of the state. But then, of course, because Saudi Arabia emerges as a state and then it emerges as an oil-producing state, this idea spreads globally. And there's these really great passages in the book that try to explain this. And then there's this one particular passage, and I'll end with this, where he provides a challenge to Muslims in terms of how Muslims can push back against the rise of Wahhabism, what Muslims can actually do. And so he says here that, he says, in my view, if instead of abandoning Islam to the Puritans or to the Wahhabis, Muslims should take moral responsibility for their religion, they should quickly realize that far from being mandated or inevitable that the Wahhabis should, win this debate in Muslim societies and should allow these misogynistic, anti-women, anti-minority traditions to win the day. He says that all Muslims have the option of making what he calls an ethical choice. He says Islamic tradition is filled with references and arguments and justifications for ethical interpretations of Islam. He says that the heritage is full of these things. And so in this particular passage, he pushes back against the rise of these anti-women interpretations that the Wahhabis are promoting. He says Islamic tradition is rich with references and arguments that reject that interpretation of women in Muslim societies. He says, for example, the Islamic tradition is full of admonitions uttered by the Prophet and by the companions, prohibiting physical violence against women, prohibiting the striking of wives. In some interesting historical reports, it is stated that in the cultural practice of Arabs, if a man strikes a woman for any reason, this man should be ostracized and shamed for the rest of his life. And that because of this man's conduct, his entire lineage would be greatly shamed for many generations to come. But, as noted earlier, he says, these traditions and reports that challenge and deconstruct the Wahhabi interpretation of Islam and their misogynist positions and prove the illegality of wife beating in Islamic law are not accessible or commonly known to contemporary Muslims. Therefore, the ethical or unethical choice of the Puritans and the Wahhabis have a monopoly over the field in contemporary Muslim societies. And then he makes an argument that what should happen is that Muslims have to take responsibility to try and provide alternative interpretations. He says, if the Wahhabis and the Puritans did not possess a virtual monopoly over the Islamic legal discourse, the misogynist tradition in Islam could be deconstructed from its very roots without having to resort to apologetics. And so this is the challenge, he says, is that we should try and provide, and I think this is what the Islamic Renaissance Front is trying to do here, is trying to provide solidly grounded Islamic arguments that provide a more ethical interpretation of Islam that doesn't allow this particular interpretation to dominate. Because most Muslims, as I said, if they're only exposed to one particular view, they're going to think, well, this is the only way. And so that's the challenge for contemporary Muslims. He's basically saying is you have to know your own heritage, you have to study it, and you have to be able to push back. Because the Wahhabis and the Puritans claim that this is authentic Islam. But it's not, it's a perversion of Islam. And this is the challenge for contemporary Muslims. So just to sort of end, before I turn it over to everyone, I said that at the beginning that these are the dark days of Islam. There's a lot of reason to be pessimistic. There's a lot of reason to be upset. But there's also reasons to be optimistic. And I think one of the reasons to be optimistic is that there's a lot of Muslims that think and realize and feel that where we are and the interpretations of Islam that dominate are fundamentally incompatible with Islam's heritage, its accomplishments. In fact, Khaled Abou El Fadl says quite, I think, explicitly in the book that had Wahhabi Islam emerged earlier in Islamic history, Islam never would have spread around the world the way that it did.
That's a good point.
It would have, there's no way to explain the spread and the popularity and the ability of Islam to spread from Morocco to Indonesia if it was motivated by this particular period. It was precisely because it had an ethical core, precisely because it was able to adapt, precisely because it had a tolerant, pluralistic, and inclusive vision that it was able to become the great civilizational tradition that it was. And so the challenge for Muslims is to try and recapture that particular period. And one of the things I like about Khaled is that you read him, and I find it very intellectually soothing. During these dark days, you read someone who really is an Islamic scholar and who's also a great moral thinker at the same time, knows the West, knows the Islamic world, and can make those types of connections. And so when I was invited to come here, I told Khaled that, look, I'm coming here and I'm going to be talking about your book. Is there any way that we can Skype you into this meeting today? And he says, yes, I'd be happy to do it. But then when I checked the time, right now in Los Angeles, it's 4 o'clock in the morning. So I said that would be a bit of a challenge for him to stay up until 4 o'clock in the morning. And so what he did for us is that he actually recorded a 15-minute message for us that I've given to Farouk, and we can maybe watch that and then go to the question and answer session. So he recorded this a few days ago, and it's directed to this particular meeting. And he was quite thrilled when I told him that his ideas would be discussed here. And so he talks about it. I should warn you that he speaks very slowly. He speaks very carefully. I think he's a better writer than he is a speaker. But if you listen to him, there's a lot of, I think, value. And he put this tape together specifically for this audience. And this is on YouTube, by the way, so you don't have to take notes. You can watch it on YouTube, and it's going to be disseminated. And I'll send it to Farouk to post on your website.